The air was 40 degrees below zero, a paralyzing wet cold that felt less like temperature and more like corrosion, eating through sheepskin linings and pooling in the marrow of their bones. At 27,000 feet, Lieutenant Colonel Clay Miller, sitting in the left seat of his B-17 Flying Fortress, could see the condensation trails of the entire 8th Air Force stretching out behind him like white scars across the vast blue canvas of 1943 Europe. They were deep over German territory, past the point of no return for any friendly fighter escort, entering what the veteran crews grimly called the Chamber of Commerce, the heavily defended industrial heartland. Below them, Aachen was a hazy geometric puzzle waiting to be pulverized. The unholy din of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines was a constant, vibrating threat to sanity, yet it was the only thing keeping the silence of the void from swallowing them whole. Miller gripped the yoke, his knuckles white, watching the clock tick down to initial point. This wasn't the romantic dogfighting depicted in recruitment posters. This was brutal, slow formation murder. The greatest cost of achieving air dominance wasn't measured in dollars or fuel, but in the rapid incineration of young American lives during those minutes when the Luftwaffe arrived. Suddenly, the sky ahead erupted, not with the sharp crack of cannon fire, but with the terrifying blooming darkness of flak. Hundreds of heavy 88mm shells exploding into perfectly timed, opaque black bouquets of shrapnel. One burst, alarmingly close, felt like a giant slamming a baseball bat against the fortress's armored belly. The plane shuddered violently, throwing the navigator momentarily off his stool. Miller's co-pilot, a fresh-faced kid named Tommy who still smelled faintly of mothballs and optimism, swore under his breath. They had been told repeatedly that tight formations was the key to mutual defense, that the combined firepower of a 3x3 Bucks could repel anything. But experience taught a harsher lesson. The tight formation simply presented a more lucrative, compact target for both flak gunners and the determined German pilots waiting above the clouds. Miller had seen 2 B-17s in the group ahead in the last week simply vanish, not crashing, not spiraling down, but literally disintegrating into fire, smoke, and disconnected aluminum shreds when a concentrated wave of enemy fighters found a weak spot. The realization that they were entirely alone, reliant only on the thin armor plating and the fragile hope that their gunners could hold their nerve, was the true weight carried by every man in that formation. The sun, high and cold, glinted off the polished noses of the enemy fighters as they dropped out of the sun. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, looking like predatory silver sharks descending into a school of slow-moving whales. This minute, this one agonizing, prolonged minute of the fighter run, was where the price of air power was paid in full, where the steel shell of the bomber became nothing more than a temporary, pressurized coffin, and where air dominance felt like a cruel statistical joke played on the men sacrificing everything to secure it.
The relentless calculus of attrition demanded not just heroes, but an endless supply of replacements. For every 4-engine giant swallowed by the flak curtain over Bremen or blasted apart by a Bf-109 over Berlin, the production lines in Seattle and Wichita churned out another, accompanied by a corresponding quota of young men rushed through the system. This was the hidden, logistical cost of dominance, the industrial dehumanization required to keep the mortal ledger balanced. Training was a whirlwind of standardization and simulated danger. At stateside bases in Nebraska and Texas, the men learned to live by the book, memorizing checklists and emergency procedures until they were indistinguishable from scripture. They were taught to see the B-17 not as a piece of magnificent machinery, but as a perishable tool, one that would be expended in the process of war. The psychological toll began long before they reached England. The trainees knew the statistics, even if the recruiting sergeants avoided dwelling on them. They knew the projected casualty rates for a 25-mission tour. They knew that statistically, the average lifespan of a waist gunner on the Pforzheim run was measured in weeks. This knowledge created a pervasive, quiet dread that seeped into the barracks and mess halls, masked by forced bravado and endless poker games. Once overseas, the replacement crews arrived in waves, anonymous faces swallowed by vast operational centers, often without the benefit of a full crew rotation. Sometimes a replacement pilot would be plugged into a veteran crew that had just lost its co-pilot, or a new bombardier might inherit the blood-stained seat of the man killed on the previous sortie. There was no time for deep bonding, only the transactional efficiency necessary for survival. The training was pragmatic, designed to maximize damage inflicted, not necessarily to maximize the individual pilot's chance of coming home. They were instructed in the precision necessary for daylight bombing, a concept that sounded noble on paper, but often failed spectacularly in the freezing reality of European weather and desperate enemy resistance. The entire ecosystem of the 8th Air Force relied on an unsustainable rate of material and human turnover. Ground crews worked themselves to exhaustion, preparing aircraft for crews they knew might not return, only to be immediately presented with a fresh B-17 off the boat and a group of youngsters still blinking in the cold, damp English light, ready to take their place in the rotation. This logistical machine, massive, impersonal, and insatiable, guaranteed air superiority not through unbreakable defenses, but through sheer, overwhelming volume, proving that even dominance has to be paid for in flesh and blood, a steady stream of young men arriving to fill the gaps left by the sudden violent vacancies high over the continent. The true cost was not just the life lost, but the life perpetually held in reserve, waiting its turn in the unforgiving rotation of death.
The Germans were not passive observers waiting for the inevitable. The period between late 1942 and early 1944 was a crucible where the sheer audacity of American daylight bombing was nearly broken by brutal, innovative German resistance. The Luftwaffe, despite being consistently outproduced and increasingly low on fuel, adapted with ruthless efficiency to the strategic threat. They learned the rhythms and weaknesses of the American formations. They understood that the B-17, despite its intimidating nickname, was most vulnerable from the front, where the collective firepower often failed to overlap effectively, and from above, where the armor plating was thinnest. This led to the rapid development of specialized tactics and terrifying new aircraft configurations. The most chilling innovation was the introduction of the Sturmgruppen, heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190s equipped with thick protective plates around the cockpit and carrying heavy, devastating 30mm cannons. These planes were not meant for elegant dogfights. They were flying tanks designed explicitly to smash through the flying fortress formation like sledgehammers. They would dive straight through the bomber stream, ignoring the light .50 caliber machine gun fire that bounced off their armor, aiming to shear off a wing or blow an engine clean out of its mounting. Miller watched one such attack during the disastrous missions to Schweinfurt, where the sky turned into a scene out of a medieval siege. A B-17, 2 positions away, took a direct hit from a Sturmgruppen's cannon blast, and the entire nose section simply peeled away, exposing the freezing interior and the suddenly vulnerable men inside. The absence of long-range escort fighters amplified this terror exponentially. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings were formidable machines, but their limited fuel capacity meant they could only shepherd the bombers a certain distance before having to turn back. Beyond that critical point, the bombers were essentially bait, drawing the Luftwaffe into the sky only to become sacrificial lambs for the strategic objective. The infamous Regensburg and Schweinfurt raids in October 1943 cemented this brutal reality. The losses were catastrophic. Upwards of 60 bombers in a single day, translating to over 600 highly trained men, vanished. These weren't isolated incidents. They were nearly paralyzing blows that forced the 8th Air Force commander to seriously reconsider the entire daylight bombing strategy. The cost of dominance was the risk of utter collapse. For months, the German defenses successfully contested the strategic air war, proving that superior production alone could not secure the sky. It required a technological countermeasure, a true strategic leap, and until that leap arrived, the men flying the B-17s were left exposed, their heroism measured not by the targets hit, but by the slim chance they survived the relentless fury unleashed upon them during their unprotected hours over the Reich. The skies over Europe remained a savage and unpredictable place until the arrival of the Mustang. A sleek, almost impossibly graceful machine that redefined the parameters of air warfare. The North American P-51 Mustang, particularly those equipped with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, was the strategic game-changer the Allied forces had desperately needed. It possessed the speed and maneuverability to match the best German fighters, but, crucially, it carried enough fuel in its massive drop tanks and internal bladders to escort the heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back, engaging the enemy right over their own airfields. This was not merely an incremental improvement, it was an existential threat to the Luftwaffe. Suddenly, the sanctuary the German pilots had relied upon, waiting until the escorts turned back before launching their attacks, was gone. The P-51 pilots were relentless. Men like Chuck Yeager and Don Gentile didn't just fend off the enemy, they hunted them down with lethal intent. The strategy shifted from merely protecting the bomber stream to achieving air superiority, a term that meant systematically dismantling the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found, whether in the air or during takeoff and landing. The German High Command was now forced to commit their precious, dwindling resources to dogfights high above their own land, bleeding experienced pilots and losing irreplaceable fuel and aircraft in skirmishes they could no longer dictate. The American pilots embraced this new, aggressive doctrine. The P-51 jockeys became the undisputed kings of the sky, flying escort one day and sweeping ahead of the bomber stream the next, challenging the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs deep into the Reich. This period, from early 1944 onward, marked the true beginning of Allied air dominance, characterized by the almost complete disappearance of large coordinated German intercepts during daylight raids. But dominance carried its own psychological burden. The fighter pilots were no longer purely defensive. They were the executioners. Their missions became focused on sheer destruction, and the exhilaration of the kill was often shadowed by the gruesome reality of what they were doing to the men and machines below. For the bomber crews, the presence of the Mustangs was a lifeline, an almost religious comfort. Seeing those silver-winged angels banking high above the formation, chasing away the deadly specks of the enemy, transformed the terror of the deep penetration raids into a manageable anxiety. The cost, however, was simply transferred. Instead of bomber crews dying in overwhelming numbers, the German fighter pilot fraternity began to be decimated. The dominance was secured by ensuring that for every U.S. pilot lost, 5 or 6 German pilots and their irreplaceable aircraft were destroyed, turning the vast blue arena into a lethal, one-sided slaughterhouse that permanently crippled the enemy's ability to wage air war.
The attainment of air dominance did not bring peace to the minds of the men who achieved it. In many ways, it simply refined the trauma. The constant, unrelenting exposure to extreme violence created wounds that were entirely invisible to the medical examiners who checked for shrapnel or burns. This was the hidden, psychic cost, the price of seeing too much death, too often in an environment of constant, terrifying vulnerability. The pilots and gunners of the 8th Air Force lived in a state of hyper-arousal, an operational stress that became cumulative and crushing. They suffered from what was then crudely termed flak fatigue or combat exhaustion, the modern equivalent of severe PTSD. It manifested in nightmares so vivid they dreaded sleep, tremors that made holding a cup of coffee impossible, and sudden irrational outbursts of anger or paralyzing fear. Many bomber crews developed highly specific rituals of superstition, clinging to small talismans or meticulous habits, desperate to impose a sliver of order on a universe governed by random shrapnel and sudden fire. Colonel Miller, despite his hardened demeanor, started compulsively checking the oxygen gauge every 30 seconds, even when he knew it was fine, a small tick of anxiety that gnawed at his focus. The stress was amplified by the unique horror of high-altitude warfare. Death wasn't clean, it was explosive and instantaneous, or slow and freezing. Men watched their closest friends tumble out of damaged aircraft, sometimes without a chute, sometimes burning. They had to fly through the debris fields of their comrades, aluminum splinters and human remains momentarily striking their own fuselage. And unlike the infantryman who might have a moment of quiet behind the lines, the bomber crews returned every single time to the same airfield, the same damp huts, forcing them to confront the empty beds of those who failed to return, only to be briefed for the next mission barely 12 hours later. There was no true decompression, only the rotation of duties. The medical system struggled to cope. Pilots who broke down were often labeled lacking moral fiber, or simply given sedatives and pushed back into the cockpit, deemed too valuable a commodity to lose to mere psychological distress. But the price of victory was etched onto their souls, a deep, pervasive weariness that promised to haunt their lives long after the last engine was shut down. This leads to a critical question.
one that defines the moral legacy of this conflict. When air dominance is achieved only through such immense, constant psychological suffering, when the heroes pay not only with their lives, but with their sanity, did the operational effectiveness justify the complete disregard for the deep emotional well-being of the men executing the mission? I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. At what point does the psychological cost of the soldier outweigh the strategic gain of the victory they secure? With air dominance firmly established by the summer of 1944, the nature of the bombing campaign shifted, introducing profound ethical gray zones that further compounded the hidden cost of victory. The stated doctrine of the U.S. 8th Air Force was precision bombing, targeting specific factories, rail yards, and military installations, a philosophy designed to cripple the enemy's war machine while minimizing collateral damage. This contrasted sharply with the British strategy of nighttime area bombing. However, the practical realities of wartime necessity, poor visibility, and the increasing desperation to shorten the conflict frequently eroded the lines of this distinction. While crews were aiming for ball-bearing plants or synthetic fuel refineries, the actual reality on the ground was often devastatingly different. Weather intervened constantly, forcing aircraft to drop their ordnance on secondary targets, or sometimes simply on the last known coordinates of an industrial complex obscured by thick cloud cover. Furthermore, the sheer scale of the bomb loads delivered meant that even a precise strike on an aircraft factory often resulted in the complete destruction of the residential neighborhoods immediately surrounding it. The American crews operating at high altitude rarely saw the immediate human consequences of their actions. Their perspective was detached, viewing the world below as a mosaic of strategic targets, geometric shapes, and smoke columns. The air war became a massive exercise in remote destruction. Yet this detachment was itself a psychological mechanism of self-preservation, another cost paid for the ability to carry out the mission. The pilots and bombardiers were acutely aware that they were delivering instruments of mass death, and the only way to function was to compartmentalize the moral implications. They focused entirely on the technical aspects: airspeed, altitude, bomb release points, and avoiding flak. The discussions among the men rarely touched upon the innocent lives potentially extinguished by their actions. Instead, they centered on payload capacity and successful evasion maneuvers. But the weight of that unacknowledged reality lingered. The cost of U.S. air dominance was not just the destruction of German war capability, but the inescapable moral burden carried by the men who executed the bombing campaign, knowing deep down that the term precision often masked an unimaginable toll on civilian populations. This internal conflict, the necessity of the war machine versus the dictates of conscience, represented a deep systemic shadow over the otherwise heroic narrative of Allied air power. For every pilot soaring above the clouds, there were hundreds of men wrestling with grease, hydraulics, and freezing rain on the muddy dispersal fields of East Anglia, the often forgotten ground crews. These were the mechanical monks of the air war, the unsung heart of air dominance, and their cost was paid in exhaustion, anxiety, and a relentless, bone-deep physical grind. Their day began hours before dawn and often stretched past midnight, dictated by the relentless operational demands. A B-17 returning from a deep penetration mission was rarely pristine. It was a patchwork of battle damage, riddled with hundreds of holes from flak and cannon fire. The ground crews, mechanics, armorers, radio specialists, and electricians had to swarm over the damaged plane immediately. They patched holes with aluminum skin, often working by the weak glow of kerosene lamps, replacing entire sections of control surfaces, mending severed hydraulic lines, and, most critically, ensuring every single one of the massive 50-caliber machine guns was cleaned, oiled, and reloaded with thousands of rounds of ammunition. The pressure was immense. The operational schedule demanded that the planes be turned around for the next day's sortie, regardless of the severity of the damage or the fatigue of the maintenance men. They didn't just fix machines, they were fixing potential coffins. They grew fiercely attached to their aircraft, giving them names like Memphis Belle or the Iron Ass, knowing the idiosyncrasies of every rivet and engine. When their plane returned safely, often smoking and limping, there was a collective silent cheer. But the moment of deepest dread for the ground crews was when the missions returned and a familiar silhouette, their plane, was conspicuously absent. They would stand by the runway, waiting, counting the circling formations, and when the last plane landed and the mud was silent again, the absence of that aircraft and the knowledge of the 11 empty bunks it represented hit them harder than any flak. They had invested their sweat, their skill, and their very hope into that piece of aluminum and those men. And then the cycle would begin again. Sometimes with a replacement bomber wheeled onto the hardstand barely hours later, ready for them to begin the grueling process of making it airworthy, ready to inherit the deadly rotation. The cost of air dominance here was the unrelenting tension of being tethered to the life and death of strangers without ever sharing the glory of the sky, shouldering the responsibility for safety while lacking the control over the outcome. They were the essential machinery of sacrifice, ensuring that the aerial titans could always rise again, even if the men who flew them could not.
While the battles over Europe demanded attrition and precision, the expansion of U.S. air dominance into the Pacific theater introduced an entirely different scale of ethical cost and operational challenge. The B-29 Superfortress, a behemoth of technology and complexity, required an entirely new type of logistical chain, dealing with distances that dwarfed the Atlantic crossing and environmental conditions that tested men and machines to the breaking point. Operating from remote islands like Tinian and Guam, the missions to mainland Japan were brutally long, often exceeding 15 hours, stretching the physical endurance of the crews to its absolute limits. But the fundamental shift was in targeting doctrine. Initially, the B-29s attempted high-altitude precision bombing, mirroring the European strategy. But success was limited by the notorious jet stream and unpredictable weather patterns. The strategic shift, orchestrated by General Curtis LeMay, was a terrifying acknowledgement of the cost required to break Japanese resistance. The move to low-altitude, massed incendiary bombing, specifically targeting Japan's densely packed wooden residential and industrial areas. This was the ultimate realization of the doctrine of destruction, prioritizing the complete collapse of the enemy's will to fight over the preservation of life or property. The firebombing raids, particularly the notorious mission over Tokyo in March 1945, created firestorms of unimaginable intensity, incinerating vast tracts of the city and causing greater immediate casualties than many other single actions of the war. For the B-29 crews, flying low enough to smell the burning city below, the emotional and moral weight of this wholesale destruction was overwhelming. They were no longer precise technicians. They were the deliverers of elemental fury. The cost of dominance in the Pacific was paid not just in the lives of the airmen, battling long odds and severe mechanical failure over the ocean, but in the acceptance that complete strategic superiority required a deliberate, horrific campaign against the civilian heart of the enemy nation. It secured the dominance needed to force a surrender, but at a price that stretched the very definition of warfare and left an indelible scar on the collective memory of those who carried out the missions. The B-29 pilots, staring down at the glowing, ash-choked destruction that stretched to the horizon, understood that they held the power to utterly erase cities, a mastery of the sky that was terrifying in its moral finality.
The attainment of ultimate air dominance, culminating in the destruction of Japan's war-making capacity and the surrender that followed, left the surviving pilots and crew members to face the equally arduous task of returning to a life that no longer made sense. This transition was the final, echoing cost of the war, the enduring shadow cast by the experiences high above the clouds. The aces who had downed 20, 30, or even 40 enemy aircraft were hailed as heroes, yet they carried the heavy ledger of every human life they had extinguished. The bomber pilots, who had navigated through flak and firestorms, guiding their fragile steel shells through the terrifying void, found the silence of peacetime deafening and confusing. Society demanded a clean break, a quick return to normalcy, to jobs, to families, to the simple expectations of suburban life. But the men who had lived for months or years on the edge of extinction could not easily shed the hypervigilance, the ingrained trauma, and the complex moral calculus that had defined their existence. Many struggled with the silence, the inability to articulate the true horror they had witnessed. How could you describe the sight of a man screaming as he tumbled past your cockpit without a parachute? How could you convey the cold terror of sitting immobile in a burning aircraft? These were experiences too vast, too gruesome, and too alien to be translated into civilian understanding. As a result, many retreated into themselves, their heroism becoming a private, isolating burden. Alcoholism, broken marriages, and inexplicable fits of rage were often the unseen shrapnel they carried home. The men who had achieved the pinnacle of military aerial prowess were now battling phantom enemies in their living rooms. The public saw the medals and the smiling faces in the photographs. They did not see the sleepless nights, the chronic guilt over the friends who didn't make it back, or the profound, unsettling question of whether the scale of the destruction they wrought was justified by the peace they secured. This lingering struggle, the difficulty of finding psychological peace after executing missions of such lethal efficiency, underscores the ultimate human cost. Dominance secured the future for millions, but often at the expense of the emotional wholeness of the few who flew those final, defining miles. The journey of air supremacy, from the desperate, unprotected bomber runs of 1943 to the overwhelming firestorms of 1945, was a saga defined by relentless innovation, immense logistical effort, and a profound degree of human sacrifice. When we look back at the historical legacy of the American Air Forces in World War II, we must measure the cost not just by the strategic objective achieved, the complete crippling of the Axis war machine, but by the price paid in the cold cockpits, the muddy dispersal fields, and the shattered minds of the young men involved. They fought a new kind of war, a high-altitude industrial conflict where technology met terror head-on. The dominance they achieved was not a gift, it was earned in the furnace of combat over places like Kassel and Munich, bought with the blood of thousands of pilots and crew members who never saw their 25th birthday. We remember the P-51 as the triumphant silver shield that won the skies, but we must also remember the men who flew them, who hunted and killed with a necessary brutality that permanently altered their perception of reality. We laud the B-17 as the flying fortress, a symbol of rugged American engineering, yet we must acknowledge that for many men it was a volatile, fragile container of life, relying on fragile hope and the thin line of camaraderie to survive missions that often claimed 20% of the force. The true, hidden cost of U.S. air dominance was the sheer, breathtaking expenditure of human potential, the constant erosion of young souls necessary to maintain the operational tempo. It was the sleepless nights of the mechanic, the shaking hands of the bombardier, the silent trauma of the pilot who survived 3 tours only to find that he couldn't live comfortably in peace. It was the willingness of a generation to commit utterly to a goal, knowing that the achievement of that dominance likely meant their own non-existence. Their bravery secured the sky, forever changing the face of modern warfare and shaping the post-war world. It is a legacy marked equally by overwhelming success and heartbreaking tragedy. Their stories deserve to be told not just for the glory, but for the profound human toll of the sacrifice they willingly made. If this story of the hidden costs and unimaginable sacrifice of the air war has touched your heart and broadened your understanding of this pivotal moment in history, please subscribe to WW2 Lore, share this video with someone who values history, and join our community as we continue to explore the legendary aircraft, heroic pilots, and the enduring lore of U.S. aviation in World War II.